In the last lecture, we added the logic to add ingredients. Now, of course, I also want to do the opposite and remove them. I already added the remove ingredient handler to the burger builder container. Now we need to fill that with some life. The logic is pretty similar to the logic we had in the add ingredient handler. It's basically just the opposite, deducting an ingredient. So I will copy the code for now, add it here. I'm interested in the old count. The updated count is the old count -1. Updated ingredients still follows the same logic here. And the same for the price, though it's of course not a price addition, it's a price deduction, which I then also want to deduct here and not add. And that actually is all. So I simply reduce my ingredient count by 1 and I deduct the price. Now with that, we're updating the ingredients and the price again. Let's now go back to, or let's now pass this method handler, this method reference here, this event handler. Let's pass it down to build controls. So there I want to have an ingredient removed prop where I pass the reference to this method we just added some logic to. And this ingredient removed property here can be used inside build controls now, where I not only want to have added on the individual build control, but also removed, and where I then will execute an arrow function where I simply execute ingredient removed and pass the type of the ingredient which should be removed, following the same logic as for the addition. Now we need to hook up that removed property in the individual build control. And there on the less button, I'll therefore add a onClick listener too, and simply execute props removed, or not executed, pass a reference to that removed props, which holds a reference to that method we want to execute, so that once the button is clicked and this event is fired, we execute that method. With that, let's save this and let's see if that works. Let's add salad and bacon, and let's remove bacon and salad and cheese. Now we have a problem if we start deducting elements we don't have though. We get an error then, and it makes sense because we tried to remove an ingredient which we don't have. So our burger builder here, the state becomes negative, we have -1 bacon, and that throws an error because we can't create an array to render from a negative value. So we should fine-tune our remove ingredient handler by also checking if we do have ingredients to begin with. So the old count of a given ingredient should be greater than 0. So if old count is smaller or equal than 0, then I essentially want to return so that nothing happens if we try to reduce an ingredient which we don't have. So now if I click on salad or bacon or anything else, nothing happens. Of course, it would be even better if the button would be disabled then. So let's introduce that logic too. There I want to pass some information about which button should be enabled and which button should be disabled to my build controls. For that, let's scroll down to the render method. And before we return JSX, I will create a new constant which I'll name disableInfo. And there I simply want to create a new object where I will distribute the properties of this state ingredients. Now keep in mind, this state ingredients simply is this object. So I basically copied it in an immutable way. Now, this object alone is of course not all the information I want. Now I'll create a for in loop. So I'll loop through all the keys in disableInfo. And I will simply check if this is 0 or less. And I will update the disableInfo key, so salad, meat, and so on, with that information of that check, so that the object will not have the shape of salad 0, meat 0, but simply if it should be disabled or not. So salad true, meat true, and true will be the value which is assigned if it should be disabled. So we will check if disableInfo for a given key is smaller or equal than 0. Because keep in mind, disableInfo key is the value of each key. So 0 in all these cases at the start. And this check here will return true or false. So we will update this in our copied object, not in the original one, the copied one, with true or false. Now with that, we can pass the disabled info to the build controls component here. So there I will set a disabled property and pass disabled info. Now, of course, we should take advantage of this disabled property in this build controls component. And there we should pass this information to the individual build control to let it know if it should disable that button or not. So I will set a disabled property there too. And for that, I will use the disabled info I'm getting on the disabled prop of build controls, not build control, build controls I'm using in the Burger Builder container. And there, I now of course want to access the disabled information for a given control type. Because keep in mind that the structure of disabled info is basically of that form: salad, true, meat, false, and so on. So this is what we'll have in this restructured object. And if it's true, it should be disabled. So what we need to access the information for a given type of control. And thankfully, we of course know that type in build controls because we're looping through controls where we store that type, which we also use for adding and removing elements, but here also to access the right disabled info. And with that, we can use the disabled prop in the individual build control to disable the less button. And disabled is a default property we can set on an HTML button element. And of course, I want to set it equal to props disabled. So either to true or to false. And I will restructure this all over multiple lines to make it a bit easier to read. So I hope the logic is clear here. We're simply making sure that the less button gets disabled if the ingredient is at 0 or less. So now you see all the buttons are blocked. The styling is set up because it was part of that CSS file I shared with you. And once we start adding an ingredient, we can click the button again. So that's our build controls working. Let's also output the price now.